Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, one of the most moving pieces of music ever written. Beethoven is generally regarded as the most innovative composer in history, a composer who shattered the rules of classical music, a personality that redefined the role of the artist on the world stage, a visionary who transformed the technology of his domain. All of this raises a question. How could a man who was deaf be history's most transformative composer? In other words, how do you explain genius? Beethoven was born with intact hearing, but into a broken family. His father was a violent man, an abusive alcoholic. All the available evidence suggests that Beethoven was a socially withdrawn, desperately unhappy youngster. And he dealt with his unhappiness by retreating into a world of music and fantasy. He practiced piano prodigiously, and he daydreamed constantly. Now, a central feature of his fantasy life was his conviction that he was the child of royalty, that the man who claimed to be his father was not his real father. This so-called family romance delusion, the belief on the part of a child that he or she is the offspring of more glamorous parents than the actual parents, it's pretty common amongst children. But it typically disappears from conscious awareness by adulthood. What's fascinating about Beethoven's case is that his belief in his royal ancestry grew even more forceful as he got older. By 1820, he is 49 years old, fully established as a renowned composer. Music encyclopedias list Beethoven as the illegitimate son of King Friedrich Wilhelm II of Prussia. Friends beg him to refute the falsehood. He adamantly refuses. The family romance delusion satisfied Beethoven's immense hunger for greatness, his desire to transcend his humble and unhappy origins. Now, he was so mistrustful of authority and so confident of his abilities, every relationship that he had with a music teacher was contentious. Age 21, he becomes the private student of Franz Joseph Haydn, who at the time was the world's most famous living composer. Haydn was 40 years older than Beethoven, and I suspect that Haydn sensed that this brilliant, surly young student of his would one day surpass him. Haydn generally offered unqualified praise for Beethoven's assignments, but once in a while he would make some suggestions about different possible modulations or harmonies. Beethoven became so incensed at even the slightest hint of criticism that he reacted by refusing to acknowledge that Haydn was his teacher. Haydn asked him if he would write on the title page of one of his earliest compositions, music by Ludwig van Beethoven, pupil of Franz Joseph Haydn. And Beethoven said, "I can't do it." And Haydn said, "Well, why not?" And Beethoven said, "Because I never learned anything from you." Now, that's what he said, but anybody who's familiar with the music of Haydn and the music of early Beethoven will recognize how thoroughly the younger composer absorbed the classical style and model established by Haydn. I want to play you an excerpt from one of Beethoven's earliest piano sonatas, and I'm going to play it on a piano from Beethoven and Haydn's era. Beethoven was in his late 20s when he started losing his hearing. He panicked. He consulted a series of physicians who prescribed a variety of remedies. Nothing worked, and Beethoven recognized that the progression would be inexorable and permanent. Becoming deaf, it's a hardship for anyone. For a musician, it is catastrophic. And Beethoven seriously contemplated suicide. But as he later wrote in a letter to his brothers, he decided to resist any suicidal impulses through a determination to fulfill his artistic destiny. And in a development that's almost too extraordinary to describe, deafness actually causes Beethoven to become a much greater composer. The rest of his life stands as one of the greatest stories of resilience in any field, a demonstration of tremendous will and courage. Every great artist and every innovative scientist needs the courage to listen to their own imagination, to follow their own inner voice, even when that voice leads them to some pretty strange places, or to places where they're all alone, completely isolated, until the rest of the world catches up. Beethoven had that courage in abundance. As his outer world kept shrinking, his inner world kept growing. It wasn't easy. His hearing rapidly got worse, so Beethoven ended his career as a piano virtuoso. No more public performances. Since he couldn't hear other people talking, relationships became increasingly frustrating, so he became much more socially isolated. Locked inside that silent world of his imagination, he was no longer hearing the music of his contemporaries like Haydn. This means he was less under the influence of prevailing musical traditions, so he was free to conjure up sounds and forms that were unlike anything anybody had previously heard. Just as Einstein had to be willing to see what nobody else sees, Beethoven had to be willing to hear what nobody else hears. And that's what he did. He pronounced himself dissatisfied with everything that he had composed up until this point. He wrote, "I must find a new path." And he starts working on his third symphony, the Eroica Symphony, which changes the course of music history. It shocked the music world with its vastness of scale, its emotional scope, its dramatic power. The year was 1804. This piece was the perfect soundtrack for a world that was in turmoil, with the French Revolution upending old social and political orders, Napoleonic Wars sweeping across Europe. When Beethoven decided to listen to his own inner voice, it took him to some wonderful new landscapes, and he wound up dragging the rest of the world along, aesthetically, technologically, and even politically. Now, I want to demonstrate Beethoven's transformative impact through an exploration of his sonata in F minor that's known as the Appassionata Sonata. This piece contains outbursts of pianistic fury that were unprecedented in 1805 when the piece was written. The pianos of Beethoven's era, they were rather delicate, virtually no resonance. The piece would have made no sense on the pianos of his time. But in that silent world of his imagination, Beethoven seems to have conjured up the sonorities of the modern-day concert grand piano. He writes passages that call for huge chords with huge amounts of sound, like this. Same passage, but on a piano from Beethoven's time. He also calls for sudden shifts from very loud to very soft, to very loud to very soft. But the pianos of his time really did not have the capacity to generate that much dynamic contrast. Listen. Same passage on the modern day piano. Beethoven also in this piece makes unprecedented technical demands on the performer. The piano sonatas composed by Haydn and Mozart were written to be played by their patrons, who were the amateur pianists of the aristocracy. But Beethoven wrote music that was considerably more difficult, and he appeared to be unfazed by the possibility that nobody, not even the professionals, would ever be able to play it. All right, so what happened? Well, piano manufacturers eventually responded to Beethoven's challenge to build better pianos. Look here, wooden frame in this piano, right over here, wooden frame. It's replaced inside here by cast iron metal plates on this piano. Allows for thicker strings, much greater string tension, much more resonance. See, there are no foot pedals on this piano, but you see foot pedals over here. 68 keys on this piano. But Beethoven imagined and called for lower bass notes, higher treble notes. 88 keys here on this piano, 20 additional keys. It's almost as if Beethoven had willed these notes into existence. Beethoven's music also led to higher professional standards for pianists. His music called for greater strength and endurance, wider leaps, thicker textures. The Appassionata Sonata was never performed during Beethoven's lifetime. It was considered to be too difficult. But pianists wanted to play it, and they eventually figured out ways to overcome its obstacles. Now, if you think Beethoven was hard on the pianos of his day, you won't believe how he treated his financial and political supporters. Composers in the 18th century were completely dependent on the aristocracy for financial backing. And Beethoven, because of his talent, he had no problems attracting funding from key members of the nobility. But he was utterly incapable of being deferential or even appropriately respectful. He ended a relationship with his most generous patron, Prince Lichnowsky, when he said to him, "There are, have been, and will be thousands of princes. There is only one Beethoven." Composers like Haydn, they were basically treated like servants. Beethoven almost single-handedly redefined the role of composer as independent, creative artists. In granting himself the privilege to follow his own muse and not bow down to any person or convention, Beethoven opened a new world for us. His Ninth Symphony, which is known as the Ode to Joy, shattered precedent. First piece ever to combine symphonic and choral music. This piece was composed 200 years ago. It remains today the preeminent universal expression of our desire for world peace, brotherhood, freedom. When the Berlin Wall came down, the Ninth was played in celebration. China, Tiananmen Square, protesters, demonstrators, they blasted this over the loudspeakers. Beethoven's music is still part of the soundtrack of our times, a compelling mix of stormy and hopeful, defiant and transcendent. How did he get there? His predecessors, composers like Haydn and Mozart, they focused on balance, clarity, and elegance. Beethoven insisted that music express intense personal emotions, anger, joy, struggle, unlimited aspiration. I'm going to finish today by playing the final 5 minutes of Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata. This piece blew people's minds when they finally heard it for the first time. During this era, final movements of sonatas were light and cheerful. If discordant elements were introduced earlier, they'd be reconciled by the end. But this piece startled and unnerved listeners with furious nonstop motion that maintains a turbulent and tragic character all the way to the end.